Tilla's wing buds forced open with a wet, splintering crack, the sound far too loud in the starport's unnatural silence. She exhaled, and the breath shook so violently it rattled her vocal cords, producing a pathetic, subsonic whine that the ship's comms picked up and broadcast to the entire bridge. Why were the escape pods still here? Would you have waited? If the sky turned black with ships, and every alarm screamed for an exit that never came, would you stay for the end? That same cloying, floral scent. Tilla had first smelled it 4 cycles earlier, standing on the observation deck as the scout ship drifted into the planet's atmosphere, watching gardens bloom over empty streets. Tilla stepped onto the tarmac of the colony's primary starport. It was, to use a technical term, unsettling. The air tasted of jasmine and ozone, a combination that shouldn't exist in a place where 10,000 humans had lived only months ago. Her opalescent skin felt tight, the precursor to a metamorphic shift she wasn't scheduled for another 3 decades. The escape pods sat in their cradles, all of them. Row after row of sleek white teardrops, untouched and pressurized. It was a failure of logic. Humans were notoriously obsessed with survival, yet they'd left their lifeboats behind. Thilla's second-in-command, a junior scout named Kale, paused near a children's playground bordering the port. This was a civilian colony. Kale's wing buds were twitching, a sign of amateurism Thilla would usually document. Highly so, Thilla replied. She noticed a stain on her left cuff. It looked like synthetic grease from the ship's airlock. She focused on the spot, tracing the outline of the smudge, while the wind rattled a nearby metal structure. They have military equipment in their playgrounds, Kale said, pointing at a set of chains and rubber seats. That's a swing set, Thilla corrected, her voice flat. She had read the cultural primers. Kale's skin rippled with a dull gray hue. Terrifying. Thilla moved toward the terminal building, her boots clicking on the pavement with a rhythmic precision that felt like a lie in this stillness. If the High Chrysalis received a report of a vanished colony with 0 signs of struggle and fully functional evacuation hardware, her promotion to Prime Scout would be buried under a mountain of bureaucratic inquiries. They didn't. They liked data that fit into neat, hexagonal grids. The playground was the worst part. A blue plastic slide, shaped like some ancient terrestrial beast, stood silent under the afternoon sun. I was about to suggest we scan for biological residue when the gardens were flourishing. Humans were messy creatures, yet their flower beds were manicured, the rows of purple and gold flora thriving without a single weed. It was as if the planet itself had agreed to keep the house clean while the owners were away. Thilla entered the primary data hub. The lights were on. The air filtration system hummed with a low, comforting vibration that felt entirely at odds with the void where the human population should be. She sat at a terminal, her fingers hovering over the interface. The power grid is at 94%, she noted. Regrettable. So the scans finish, and I'm looking at power levels that don't make sense, and the junior scouts are staring at me, and I realize nobody in this room is breathing. Thilla began to pull the sensor logs from the day of the disappearance, her movements clinical, despite the way her wing buds throbbed against her shoulder blades, a persistent, dull ache that reminded her she was 40 cycles overdue for a true rest. The data was a cascading collapse of information, a series of timestamps that indicated a hostile fleet, likely the Ravagers from the Outer Rim, had entered the system with their weapons hot and their intent broadcast in the screaming static of war hymns. It should have been a slaughter, a one-sided erasure of a peaceful farming community that had no orbital defenses and only a handful of security personnel who were probably better at settling property disputes than fighting a genocidal armada. "Commander," Kale whispered. His skin had gone almost entirely matte. The distress signal. "Look at the response pings." Thilla looked. The pings on the sensor log were not the standard blue of Allied recognition. They were a riot of colors, 12 distinct species signatures, several of which had spent the last 3 centuries trying to erase one another from the galactic map. I noted the timestamps. The first response had arrived 3 minutes after the human distress signal went out. The last, a heavy cruiser from the Val-Cache hegemony, arrived 8 minutes later. The Val-Cache do not respond to distress calls. They barely respond to diplomatic greetings. Phila watched the playback. The hostile fleet, the Ravagers, had dropped into the system with the grace of a falling rock, only to find themselves surrounded by a fleet that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't a battle. It was a custodial action. 12 different species, some of whom had active border wars with each other, had synchronized their weapon systems to protect a colony that produced nothing but corn and children's literature. It was, in my professional opinion, a statistical impossibility. They didn't just have allies, Kale whispered, his opalescent skin hardening into a jagged gray chitin. The metamorphic regression was accelerating. His wing buds were no longer pulsing. They were calcifying into sharp, defensive spikes. They had a web. Phila ignored the pain in her own shoulders. She noticed a small plastic figurine on the desk. A human superhero, perhaps. Its cape was chipped. She found herself wondering if the child who owned it had been frightened or if they had simply known what was coming to save them. The logs terminated at a final message, left on a looping broadcast. Phila tapped the screen. You were warned. This is the receipt. The words were remarkably succinct. Phila understood then that the receipt wasn't the message. The empty planet was the receipt. The fact that 10,000 humans had been plucked from a death zone in less than an hour by species who normally hated the smell of each other. That was the proof of purchase. It was like vacuum decay. I've always found the theory fascinating. You touch one point of space, trigger a lower energy state, and the collapse propagates outward at the speed of light, rewriting the laws of physics as it goes. Humanity was the trigger. They had inserted themselves into the galaxy and changed the energy state of every species they touched. One colony was threatened, and the collapse of old animosities had propagated through 12 systems at the speed of information. Phila's wing buds forced open with a wet, splintering crack. She exhaled, and the breath shook so violently it rattled her vocal cords, producing a pathetic, subsonic whine that the ship's comms picked up and broadcast to the entire bridge. And now, in the terminal hub, under the weight of the data, the silence finally made sense. She stood before the wall of untouched escape pods. They were pristine, white, useless. They hadn't been left behind because of panic or failure. They were left because the humans had more friends than they had seats. When the sky turned black, they hadn't run for the lifeboats. They had waited for the neighbors to arrive. Phila looked at the smudged grease on her cuff. It was a minor blemish on a career that was about to be redefined by a report she didn't want to write. She walked out of the terminal and back toward the starport. The gardens were still growing. The swings were still moving. Kale stood by the ramp of their scout ship, his body heavy and armored in the ugly gray shell of a Clythara who had seen too much. "Commander," he said, his voice grating through a partially hardened throat. "What do we call this?" Phila looked at the rows of empty pods, then up at the stars where 12 different species had once stood as a single wall. "An evacuation plan," she said.